Springfield Church of the Brethren Message of the Week. Hi, this is Pastor Dave Weiss from Springfield Church of the Brethren. We're here with a special message from our Esther series. This is called Esther for Such a Time as This, Part 6. Be careful what you wish for. When we last left Esther, her plan was in motion. She had already hosted the evil Haman for a banquet, just him and the king, and now he was invited to another one the next day. Haman is feeling really full of himself, but just seeing his archenemy Mordecai ruined his day. He hates Mordecai and the Jews so much that he can't even enjoy all the money, wealth, and power, not to mention the favor he has with the king. He consoles himself with the fact that the annihilation of the Jews has been decreed, and with the 75-foot-high gallows or impaling pole he is building in his backyard for the purpose of putting his mortal enemy Mordecai to death. Haman's pride is out of control, and it will be his downfall, but not yet. Before that, I want to key in on one concept that I have repeated several times in this series. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. Even if you don't know how the story ends, it should be pretty obvious that things are not going to end well for Haman. But even before the story comes to an end, Haman is going to be served a big slice of humble pie. And that brings us to my title for this message. Have you ever heard the saying, be careful what you wish for? It presents this idea that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to us is for us to get what we want. That if we get what we want, it will end up being not at all what we want. My oldest son, Brandon, has an expression. If you ask him how he's doing, he'll say, I'm living the dream, and then he'll pause and say, one nightmare at a time. And it's true. Sometimes the dream becomes a nightmare. We get what we want and discover it's not all that we thought it would be. Well, what happened to Haman was even worse. Now remember, we have the benefit of having the background of the story. Haman doesn't have that. Go to Esther 6:1. That night the king could not sleep, so he ordered the book of the Chronicles of the record of his reign to be brought in and read to him. Now, I know it seems like every time I talk about King Xerxes in this story, I do it kind of negatively. But think about what this says about his life. The king was having trouble sleeping. I think that goes with leadership. There are a lot of nights where I stare at the ceiling trying to figure out what to do to help someone or how to fix something I forgot to do. I'm a leader with somewhere between 50 and 60 people. Xerxes probably leads that many nations. So of course he can't sleep. But what does he do when he can't sleep? Probably the same thing you did when you were about 3. Read me a story. But what is the story? The record of his reign. In other words, read me a story about me. And I want to be so critical of that, but I can't, because God used this incident to move the story forward. There is something divine in this sleepless night, and the next time you and I have one of those, maybe we should keep that in mind. Maybe this sleepless night is really just a wake-up call from God. Look at verse 2. It was found recorded that Mordecai had exposed Bigthana and Teresh, 2 of the king's officers who guarded the doorway, who had conspired to assassinate King Xerxes. Remember, this happened at the end of chapter 2? 2 of the palace guards plotted to kill the king, but Mordecai found out about it, told Esther, and the 2 guards were caught, convicted, and hanged or impaled. Mordecai saved the king's life that day. And yet the end of chapter 2 handles it almost like a footnote. The last part of verse 23 says, all this was recorded in the book of the annals in the presence of the king. In chapter 2, this almost is made to feel like a minor detail. But the thing is, when we read any story, even a true biblical story, those things that seem to be little details often end up being major plot points down the road. Needless to say, someone saving your life should never be a minor detail in your story. And yet it appears this detail was overlooked. It makes you wonder how many death threats Xerxes actually faced, that this appeared to have just slipped his mind. Good thing someone thought to write it down. Look at verse 3. What honor and recognition has Mordecai received for this, the king asked. Nothing has been done for him, his attendants answered. Xerxes is an important man with a lot of responsibility. He probably made the assumption that someone had blessed Mordecai handsomely, but now he finds out that Mordecai's good deed to him has gone unrewarded. Xerxes wants to do something about it. It's not right that saving the life of the king went unrewarded. It's now time to go to verse 4, but before we go there, I have to tell you, it's at this point that the story gets almost funny. Now, I know the book of Esther is not a comedy, but what happened here is at the very least poetic justice. The king wants to reward Mordecai, but he is not sure what the right gift would be to honor such a meaningful, important action as saving the life of the king. He needs help to figure out what to do, so he looks for help. Can you guess what happens? Verse 4. The king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the palace to speak to the king about impaling Mordecai on the pole he had set up for him. Remember, Haman wants to kill Mordecai. And he built a huge impaling pole or a gallows in his backyard for that purpose. In the last chapter, he was determined to go to the king today to ask that Mordecai be put to death so he could be done with him and enjoy his second banquet. King Xerxes, on the other hand, wants to reward Mordecai, and keep in mind, neither man knows what the other one has in mind. This is where it gets funny. His attendant answered, "Haman is standing in the court. Bring him in," the king ordered. Now picture this. The king sends for Haman. The attendants rush out quickly to get him. He's already full of himself, so this would probably be very exciting for Haman. Look at verse 6. When Haman entered, the king asked him, "What should be done for the man the king delights to honor?" Okay, Haman may have been caught a little off guard here, but you know who he thinks the king is referring to, right? If you don't, look at the second half of the verse. Now Haman thought to himself, "Who is there that the king would rather honor than me?" Remember, this is a guy who is so prideful. Clearly, there is no one in the whole kingdom who the king would rather honor than me. He doesn't even stop to ask who the king is honoring. He just starts to think about how he wants to be honored, because pride is like that. Look at verse 7. So he answered the king, "For the man the king delights to honor, have him bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with the royal crest placed on his head. Then let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is to be done for the man the king delights to honor.'" Okay, I know most of you know what happened next. Pretend you don't. Haman thinks this is how he would like to be honored, because clearly Haman believes this honor will be his. The royal robe signifies royalty. The king's horse backs it up. Remember, Haman gets his identity from the admiration of people. People seeing him in the king's robe on the king's horse will get him the one thing that his money can't buy: respect. When the people see him on that horse being led around by a prince shouting, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor," surely that will get him the admiration of the people, and that's what he wants. See, the things of this world can't really satisfy our hearts, and so the more we get, the more we want. Because maybe when we get all the world has to offer, then we'll be happy. Have you been there? I have. I was. I kept thinking that when I reached a certain level of success, people would finally see I had value. When I created something that made me famous, then I would have value. And I hit a couple of levels, or at least made small advances, and you know what happened? The goal kept moving. What I was failing to see was there were already people who thought I was important. People who loved me, not because of what I had or what I did, but because they loved me. And I served a God who had his only son die in my place. That was my value, and I couldn't even see it. I see it now. I don't have everything the world has to offer, but I'm accepted by the one who matters most. And if you are a believer in Jesus Christ, so are you. And if you're not, what's holding you back? All this world has to offer will come up empty because you can't keep it and you can't take it with you. Lay it out at the feet of Jesus and walk out of here today with the gift that matters most. Otherwise, you'll end up like Haman, missing the mark, resentful, prideful, and lacking what matters most. See, Haman thinks the king means to honor him, but today that honor falls to someone else. Haman thinks the king means to honor him, so he sets up exactly the way he wants to be honored. Can you imagine how he felt when the king said, "Go at once, get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended." Ouch. I mean, that had to hurt, right? His intent was to walk into that room and ask the king for Mordecai's death, but he'll leave that room making all the arrangements to honor Mordecai in the way he would like to be honored. I mean, you have to admit, this is a little funny, or at least ironic. I feel a little shortchanged here because the Bible doesn't give us the conversation that happened between the two men. I just can't picture that went particularly well. Nonetheless, the Bible gives us exactly what we need, and so when we read verse 11, we see this. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He robed Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." I can almost feel sorry for Haman here. He has to be the honor guard for his sworn enemy. He knows his role in life well enough to know not to defy the king, and yet that means he has to walk up and down the streets, leading the horse and making the proclamation over and over and over again. Everything he wished for, he was doing for his enemy. Be careful what you wish for, because sometimes what comes around goes around. Haman thought this day would end much differently. He at the royal banquet eating sumptuous food and drinking wine in the king's liberality, while Mordecai twitched out his last breaths on the impaling pole or gently swinging in the breeze from the gallows high above the city for the world to see. His wish for himself was given to Mordecai, but what about his wish for Mordecai? Verse 12, afterward Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home, his head covered in grief, and told Zeresh his wife and all his friends everything that had happened to him. The honor is over, and Mordecai's life is returned to normal. He returned to the palace gate, staying near to his daughter, the queen. Haman's been humiliated, but the annihilation order still stands, and it can't be revoked. Mordecai's been honored, but his life is still in danger. Haman, on the other hand, is grieving. Where last week he boasted about all that he had, today he shared what happened to him. He has his head covered in grief. I get the idea this is a lot more than humiliation. His advisors and his wife Zeresh said to him, "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." Basically, what they're saying is everything you wanted done for you was done for Mordecai, and now everything you want to do to Mordecai will be done to you. Haman's wife and advisors can see the writing on the wall, and so it appears can Haman. And this is a time when Haman would probably like to run. But there's a problem. Look at verse 14. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared. You know, he feels a lot different about this banquet than he did yesterday, right? Yesterday, the banquet was a sign of Haman receiving all that he had wished for himself. Today, he probably sees it as a sign of receiving what he wished for Mordecai. Be careful what you wish for, especially if you're wishing ill for others, because sometimes what comes around goes around. So what can we learn from all this? What can we apply from Esther chapter 6 to our everyday lives? Well, first of all, God is good, just, and righteous all day, every day, all the time. This means we have to be careful what we wish for, especially if what we're wishing for is ill will towards someone else. The person Haman saw as an enemy was a man put in his place for such a time as this, to be used to rescue God's chosen people. Haman's scheming and his pride put him at odds not just with the Jews, not just with Haman, but with God. At times, we will no doubt find ourselves at odds with others, and sometimes it will feel justified. Friend, sometimes it will be justified. The thing is, we don't always know what God is doing. Perhaps that person that angers us is being prepared by God to do his will. I think this is why God demands that we leave vengeance to him, and why Jesus told us to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us. Anything less than love may put us in the place of Haman, filled with bitterness and pride, until that pride puts us in opposition, not just to the other person or people group, but to God. When the Bible tells us that God opposes the proud but gives grace to the humble, what he's saying is pride puts us in a place where we are opposing God, the most powerful force in the universe, and that will only ever be a losing battle. The opposite of pride is humility. The opposite of proud is humble. When we approach life with pride, we fail to see our fallen state before God, and we fail to see our fallen state, we miss our need for the Lord. There are two paths we can take to humility. The first is to humble ourselves. We see this in Esther. Before she went before the king, she submitted herself to God. We see this when she called the nation to a time of prayer and fasting. She wasn't taking her situation for granted by virtue of her position. She may have been queen, but she still humbled herself before the Lord, and we would be wise to do the same. Otherwise, we may end up taking the second path to humility, humiliation. This is what happened to Haman here in chapter 6. Thinking he would be the one to be honored, he set up an extravagant reward, having to bestow all that he desired on Mordecai is the peak of humiliation. But lest you think humiliation is always a bad thing, humiliation can lead us to humility. And if it does that work in our lives, it's not punishment, it's God's mercy. Here's the thing. Haman never humbled himself, even when he was humiliated. He was hateful and prideful and arrogant, and as such, he sealed his fate. But when we are humiliated, it may be God's way of helping us to change the road we're on. Haman was headed to his own backyard, to a painful road to oblivion. That's what hatred and bitterness and unforgiveness bring with them. Give those things to God. Humble yourself and submit to him, because he will always do everything right. Amen. This has been the Springfield Church of the Brethren Message of the Week from Pastor Dave Weiss.